They say that money can't buy you happiness. I've heard that line my whole life, usually from people who seem to have plenty of both. But they're wrong in a way. They miss the most important part of the equation. Money doesn't buy happiness, but it can buy something pretty damn close: freedom. The freedom to silence a 6 a.m. alarm clock, the freedom from the fluorescent flicker of an office ceiling for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, the freedom to just breathe. But what happens when that freedom, that ultimate gift, comes with a price you could never possibly imagine? What if, in order to be set free, you first have to confront the very prison built inside someone else's mind? This is my story. It's the story of how $4 million didn't set me free but locked me in deeper, only to eventually finally show me the real way out. My name is Alex Carter, and until 6 months ago, my life was a portrait painted in shades of gray. I'm 29, and I was working as a junior graphic designer at a soul-sucking marketing firm in downtown Chicago. It sounds creative, right? The reality was anything but. My job mostly consisted of resizing banner ads for breakfast cereals and making a law firm's logo look more trustworthy by shifting its shade of blue by 2 degrees. Every day was a quiet war between the artist I wanted to be and the stark reality of spreadsheets, Zoom meetings, and emails that began with, "Just circling back on this, I lived in a shoebox apartment in Logan Square with a view of a brick wall and a heating bill in the winter that was enough to make you break into a cold sweat. I had good friends and a family that loved me in their own practical way, but there was this persistent, nagging feeling that I was living someone else's life. The real me, Alex the painter, Alex the explorer, was buried under a mountain of student loans and societal expectations. In that monochromatic landscape of my life, there was one singular slash of vibrant color: my Aunt Carol. She was nothing like the rest of my family. My parents, Tom and Susan, are pragmatists. They're classic. Baby boomers work hard, save your money, and believe the path to success is paved with a practical college degree and a steady job with a 401 Kelvin. My older sister, Jessica, is the living embodiment of their philosophy. She's a successful corporate lawyer married to an orthopedic surgeon living in a suburban house so large you need Google Maps to find the bathroom. They love me, I know they do, but they never really got me. They saw my passion for art as a nice hobby rather than a calling. But Aunt Carol was different. She was my mother's younger sister, but they were like opposite poles of a magnet. While my mom found comfort in order and predictability, Aunt Carol thrived in a world of beautiful, chaotic whimsy. She lived alone in a sprawling, slightly dilapidated farmhouse in rural Michigan, about a 3-hour drive from the city. The house sat on a huge, overgrown piece of land surrounded by a silence that was almost mystical. I didn't see her often, maybe once or twice a year for holidays when I was a kid. But those memories were burned into my mind. She smelled like old books and chamomile tea. She never asked me about my grades or my career plans. She asked me about my dreams. She was the only person who would look at my childish doodles and see not just scribbles but potential and emotion. As I got older, the visits became less frequent. Aunt Carol became more and more of a recluse. My mom would say she just valued her privacy, but there was always an unsaid story hanging in her tone. Our phone calls became my lifeline. We could talk for hours. She never gave advice, but instead asked questions that made me find my own answers. "Do you feel cramped, Alex?" she asked me once after I'd been complaining about my cubicle. That feeling of being cramped doesn't come from the space around you. It comes from the walls you build inside you. She said things like that. Profound, a little cryptic, but they always stuck with me. Every year for my birthday, she wouldn't send a generic card. Instead, a small box would arrive. Inside, there would always be some strange object: an antique compass, a well-worn fountain pen, a perfectly smooth river stone, along with a single sheet of paper with a handwritten quote and a crisp $100 bill. It was our little secret. "For your adventure fund," one note read. And then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in April, the call came. I was in the middle of a meeting about how to make a yogurt ad look more engaging, and my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was my mom. I slipped out of the conference room, annoyed at the interruption. "Mom, I'm in a meeting," I whispered. But the silence on the other end of the line made my chest tighten. "Alex," my mom said, and her voice cracked. "It's your Aunt Carol. She's gone." The world just dissolved. The fluorescent lights, the droning voices from the conference room, the stale coffee smell, it all vanished. There was only my mother's voice and a vast cold emptiness that had just opened up inside me. She'd passed in her sleep, a heart attack. Quick and painless, the doctor had said. But to me it felt like a detonation. The one vibrant slash of color in my world had just been erased. The next few days were a blur. The funeral was small and quiet, which felt fitting for how she lived. Just our family and a few elderly neighbors from her small town. Standing there by her graveside, listening to the generic platitudes about a life well lived, I couldn't shake the feeling that none of them really knew her. They saw the recluse, the oddball, aunt and sister. I saw the guide, the kindred spirit I never got the chance to fully understand. A week later, a letter arrived. It was on thick, cream-colored paper, embossed with the name of a law firm I'd never heard of, Abernathy and Thorne. The letter requested my presence at their office to discuss the last will and testament of Miss Carol Ann Miller. I figured it was a formality. Maybe she'd left me her collection of old books or a few pieces of antique furniture. I called my mom, who was just as mystified. "We didn't think Carol had much to leave," she said. "She lived so simply." Mr. Abernathy's office was in an old building in Chicago's Loop, the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped in the 1942nd. The air was thick with the scent of leather-polished wood and well-kept secrets. Miss Abernathy himself was a tall, lean man with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. He shook my hand, a firm, dry grip, and motioned for me to sit in a creaking leather chair. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice, a low, steady baritone. "I was your aunt's estate attorney for over 20 years. She was a very particular woman." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He opened a leather portfolio and produced a document tied with a ribbon. "This is Carol's final will. It is for the most part quite straightforward." He cleared his throat and began to read in a measured monotone. There were small bequests to a few animal charities and the local library. The house and the land it sat on were to be donated to a local nature conservancy. And then he paused, looking at me over the top of his half-moon glasses. "And now," he said, "we come to the residuary estate. That is, the remainder of the assets. After all, debts and specific bequests are paid." He took a slow breath. "It reads, all the rest residue and remainder of my estate, including all of my cash, stocks, bonds, and investment accounts, I give devise and bequeath to my beloved nephew, Alex Thomas Carter." He looked up from the paper. I just stared at him, my mind a complete blank. "I'm sorry," I stammered, "the rest of the estate." "What does that mean exactly?" Mr. Abernathy leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over the document. "Mr. Carter, your aunt was an incredibly shrewd investor. She lived frugally, but she was very, very successful with the inheritance she received from your grandparents decades ago." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in the quiet room. "After accounting for all taxes and fees, the total value of the inheritance bequeathed to you is estimated to be just over $4 million. $4 million. The words didn't compute. They floated in the air between us, foreign and unreal. $4 million to me, a guy whose biggest financial decision that month was whether to splurge on the name-brand pasta sauce. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. My hands started to shake. Freedom. A voice screamed inside my head. This was it. No more banner ads. No more cubicle. I could finally live. I could finally breathe. I don't understand." I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "It's quite clear," Mr. Abernathy said calmly. You are the sole beneficiary. However, he added, and his tone shifted ever so slightly, there is a condition. A rather significant one. My head snapped up. A condition. Of course there was a condition. This couldn't be that simple. He slid a separate sheet of paper across the polished mahogany desk toward me. Your aunt stipulated in a binding addendum that before the funds can be transferred to you, you and you alone must personally clear out her house. Every single item must be removed, sorted, and disposed of as you see fit. You are not permitted to hire a professional service to do it for you. The task must be completed within 90 days of you taking possession of the keys. The Nature Conservancy that will receive the property has already agreed to these terms. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. Your aunt was very clear on this point. She called it, and I quote, the most important part of the inheritance. My mind was reeling. Clear out her house, her old, dusty farmhouse. How hard could that be? A few weekends, a dumpster, maybe some help from my dad. It was a strange request, sure, but for $4 million it was a small price to pay. It was a formality. I felt a smile creep onto my face, a genuine, life-altering smile. Okay, I said, my voice filled with a giddy relief. Okay, I can do that. That's no problem at all. Mr. Abernathy just looked at me, his expression unreadable. He held out a small, ornate iron key. Very well, Mr. Carter. Here is the key to the house. Your 90 days begin now. I took the key, its cold metal, a solid, tangible piece of my new reality. I had no idea, standing there in that quiet, wood-paneled office, that he hadn't just handed me the key to a house. He had handed me the key to a labyrinth, to a life I never knew existed, and to a secret that would change not just my future, but my entire understanding of the past. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story and you want to know what secrets that old farmhouse holds, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You're not going to want to miss what happens next. The 3-hour drive from Chicago to rural Michigan felt like a journey to another planet. With every mile I put between myself and the city, the concrete and steel gave way to rolling green hills and endless fields of corn. The air itself seemed to change, losing its gritty urban edge and taking on the sweet, earthy smell of damp soil and blossoming trees. I drove with the windows down, letting the wind whip through my hair, a stupid grin plastered on my face. $4 million. The phrase kept replaying in my mind like the chorus of a hit song. I was composing my resignation email in my head, a magnificent work of art that would be both professional and subtly triumphant. I was mentally shopping for studio space, a place with huge windows and northern light, where I could finally unpack the canvases and paints that had been gathering dust in my closet for years. The condition clearing out the house felt less like a task and more like a final, intimate farewell to my aunt. It was a chance to walk through her space one last time, to touch the things she'd touched, to say goodbye properly. I pictured a weekend of dusty but rewarding work. I'd put on some good music, sort through her collection of old books and quirky antiques, maybe find a few keepsakes to remember her by. I imagined it would be a cathartic experience, a way to process my grief while literally clearing a path to my new life. The 90-day time limit seemed absurdly generous. I figured I could have it done in 2, maybe 3 weekends tops. I was so beautifully, so tragically naive. I turned off the main highway onto a series of smaller, winding country roads until I reached Willow Creek Road. And there it was, Aunt Carol's house. It was just as I remembered it from my childhood visits, only a little more weathered, a little more claimed by nature. It was a classic 2-story American farmhouse with white paint peeling in places and dark green shutters. A wide, welcoming porch wrapped around the front, complete with a faded rocking chair that swayed gently in the breeze. The property was gorgeous, wildly overgrown, with towering oak trees, rambling rose bushes, and wildflowers that grew in chaotic bursts of color. It was isolated, peaceful. It was from the outside an idyllic country dream. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and walked up the stone path to the front door, the old iron key feeling heavy in my hand. A sense of nostalgia washed over me. I remembered chasing fireflies in that yard and sitting on that porch swing with Aunt Carol as she told me stories about the constellations. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the bittersweet wave of memories that was sure to hit me when I stepped inside. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying heavy clunk. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me first. It wasn't the pleasant nostalgic scent of old books and chamomile tea I was expecting. It was a thick, stagnant wave of air that smelled of dust decay, old paper, and something else. Something vaguely sour and cloying that I couldn't quite identify. It was the smell of a space that hadn't properly breathed in a very, very long time. My eyes, still adjusting from the bright sunlight, struggled to make sense of the scene before me. The foyer was not a foyer. It was a canyon. A narrow path, no wider than my shoulders, snaked its way between towering, precarious stacks of everything. Newspapers, magazines, junk mail, cardboard boxes, plastic bags filled with unknown contents. The stacks reached from the floor almost to the ceiling, leaning against each other like tired old skyscrapers. My heart began to pound in my chest. This wasn't right. Maybe it was just the entryway. Maybe she was just messy. I squeezed my way down the narrow path, my shoulders brushing against the teetering walls of paper. I reached what I assumed was the entrance to the living room, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was impassable. Every square inch of floor space was covered. Not just covered, but buried. Buried under a mountain range of possessions. There were boxes spilling over, with clothes, stacks of vinyl records, dozens of old lamps in various states of disrepair, collections of glass bottles and piles upon piles of books, not neatly arranged on shelves, but heaped in great sprawling mounds. The furniture, a sofa, armchairs, a coffee table was completely submerged, visible only as vague lumps beneath the debris. The only way to move was through the same kind of narrow goat trail that led from the front door. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't clutter. This wasn't messiness. This was something else entirely. This was a tomb. A tomb of things. I felt a rising tide of panic. My idyllic vision of a nostalgic weekend cleanup evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, claustrophobic horror. How could this be, my Aunt Carol? The woman who spoke of inner freedom and shedding attachments, the woman who lived so simply in my mind. How could she have lived like this? It was a betrayal. It felt like a deliberate lie, as if the person I knew was just a character she played on the phone. I forced myself to move, to push deeper into the house. Each room was a new chapter in the same terrifying story. The dining room table was invisible beneath a sea of old mail and empty food containers. The kitchen was a nightmare landscape of greasy boxes, unwashed dishes that must have been there for months, if not years, and stacks of old appliances still in their packaging. I couldn't even see the countertops or the stove. I made my way to the stairs, which were terrifyingly slick with old magazines, each step a potential avalanche. I had to hold on to the teetering walls of junk on either side to pull myself up. The upstairs was worse. The guest room where I had stayed as a child was filled to the ceiling with bags of yarn and fabric. Her bedroom was the heart of it all. The bed was an island in a sea of clothes, books, and shoeboxes. A small space, barely the size of her body, was cleared for sleeping. The rest was a chaotic monument to accumulation. The air was thickest here, and I finally identified the sour smell rotting food hidden somewhere in the layers. I backed out of the room, my stomach churning. I stumbled back downstairs and out onto the front porch, gasping for fresh air as if I had just surfaced from underwater. I leaned against the railing, my hands shaking, my mind screaming. 90 days. I had 90 days to clear this. This wasn't a one-man job. This was a job for a hazardous waste crew. This would take an army. But the will was specific. You and you alone must personally clear out her house. Why? Why would she do this to me? Was this some kind of sick joke? A cruel test? The $4 million suddenly felt impossibly far away. A cruel mirage on the other side of an unclimbable mountain of trash. The anger came first, hot and blinding. I was angry at her for the deception, for leaving me this burden. Then came the confusion. The woman who sent me a single perfect river stone, who spoke of the simple beauty of a sunset, how could she have drowned herself in this much stuff? It didn't make sense. And finally, beneath the anger and confusion, a deep, profound sadness settled in my bones. She had been living in a prison of her own making. The woman who was my beacon of freedom had not been free at all. She had been trapped, and I had never known. For all our hours on the phone, for all our supposed connection, I had been completely blind to her reality. As I stood there, a car pulled into the driveway next door. An elderly woman with a kind, wrinkled face got out and started tending to her rose bushes. She saw me and gave a tentative wave. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. "Hello there," she called out, her voice friendly. "You must be Carol's nephew." "Alex, is it?" I managed a weak nod. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Martha," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked over to the edge of her yard. "I'm so sorry for your loss, dear. Your aunt was a sweet woman. Kept to herself, but always sweet." She paused, her eyes lingering on the front door of the house, which I had left ajar. She looked back at me, her expression softening with pity. "You've been inside, then?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I had no idea," I whispered. Martha sighed, a long, weary sound. "None of us knew how bad it had gotten until the paramedics had to come last week. They had to clear a path just to get the gurney in. Poor dear. We tried, you know. A few of us from the neighborhood. We'd offer to help her with spring cleaning offer, to take things to the donation center for her. But she'd just get so agitated, anxious. She'd say she knew where everything was and she needed it all." Martha shook her head slowly. "It's a sickness, you know. Like any other. A sickness." The word hung in the air. It hadn't occurred to me in that way. I had seen it as a choice, a flaw, a mess. But a sickness, the thought shifted something inside me. It didn't lessen the monumental task ahead, but it began to reframe it. This wasn't a joke. This was a cry for help that had gone unanswered for years. I spent the rest of the day making a futile attempt to start. I bought gloves, heavy-duty trash bags, and a face mask. I decided to start with one small corner of the living room, but every item I touched felt connected to 10 others. I'd pull out a stack of newspapers from 1,998, and it would cause a small avalanche of magazines and takeout menus. Underneath those, I found a set of perfectly preserved, unused porcelain dolls still in their boxes. Why? Why buy them just to bury them? After 3 hours of back-breaking, dusty, emotionally draining work, the corner I had been working on looked almost exactly the same. I had filled 10 trash bags but made no visible dent. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I sat on the porch steps covered in grime and sweat, and felt a despair so profound it was physical. This was impossible. The will was a trick. The money was a lie. There was no way I could do this. Not in 90 days. Not in a year. My new life, the one I had spent the entire car ride dreaming about, felt like it was turning to dust in my hands. I looked at the old iron key, and for the first time I saw it for what it really was. Not the key to my freedom, but the key to my aunt's cage, and she had locked me inside it with her. The first week was a lesson in futility. I drove out to the house every day, a grim commute from my Chicago apartment to the quiet chaos of Willow Creek Road. I told my boss I needed to take some personal time to handle a family estate, a vague explanation that he accepted with an indifferent shrug. My family, of course, was ecstatic about the money, but completely oblivious to the reality of the situation. "Just hire a crew," Alex, my sister Jessica, had said over the phone, her voice laced with practical impatience. "There are services for this kind of thing. You shouldn't be wasting your time. I tried to explain the condition in the will, but I could tell she didn't get it. To her, it was an eccentric inconvenience. She couldn't grasp the sheer physical scale of it. Nobody could unless they were standing in it. Each morning I'd suit up like a soldier going into battle. Old clothes, steel-toed boots, thick work gloves, and a respirator mask to protect my lungs from the decades of dust and God knows what else. I developed a system, if you could call it that. I'd focus on one small, manageable square of a room at a time, a 3-foot by 3-foot grid. I'd sort everything into 3 piles: obvious trash, potential donations, and a third, unsettlingly large pile I labeled Keep, Investigate. The trash was the easiest part emotionally. Empty food containers, yellowed newspapers, broken trinkets. It was a relief to bag them up and haul them out to the giant dumpster I'd rented, which sat in the driveway like a metal beast waiting to be fed. But the other piles were harder. So much harder. The donation pile was filled with things that were perfectly good, even valuable. Brand new kitchen appliances still in their boxes, beautiful sets of dishes that had never been used, clothes with the price tags still on them. It was a museum of unfulfilled intentions. She had bought these things, perhaps imagining a different life where she would use them, a life where she entertained guests or wore beautiful new dresses. But that life never came, and so the items were simply swallowed by the hoard, their potential buried. The most difficult pile, however, was the Keep, Investigate one. Because as I dug deeper, I began to realize this wasn't just a random accumulation of junk. It was a layered, chaotic archive of a life. It was my aunt's life, told not in chapters, but in strata of sedimented objects. Deep in a pile in the living room, I found my own childhood. A box filled with every drawing I had ever sent her, every report card, every goofy school picture. They were perfectly preserved. She had kept everything. Beneath that, I found a collection of playbills from Broadway shows in the 1982nd. Had she lived in New York, I never knew that. I found photographs of her as a young woman, vibrant and laughing, surrounded by friends on a beach, looking so impossibly different from the reclusive woman I knew. Who were these people? What happened to them? The house was a fortress, and every object was a brick in its walls. And as I slowly, painstakingly began to dismantle those walls, I felt like I was starting to dismantle the mystery of my aunt herself. The work was physically brutal, but it was the emotional toll that truly exhausted me. One moment, I would be filled with a simmering resentment, cursing her for leaving me this Herculean task. The next, I'd find a faded photograph or a half-finished knitting project and be overwhelmed with a grief so sharp it would bring me to my knees. I wasn't just cleaning a house. I was performing an autopsy on a life, sifting through the wreckage to understand what had gone so wrong. The turning point came at the end of the second week. I was in what I thought was a small study off the main living room. The room was almost entirely filled with books and magazines stacked so high and tight that it was like excavating a paper quarry. I was working my way along one wall when my hand brushed against something hard and wooden behind a stack of National Geographic magazines from the 1972nd. It was a desk. A beautiful old roll-top desk, completely hidden from view. It took me the better part of a day to clear a space around it, and when I finally did, I felt a jolt of excitement. This was different. This felt intentional. Most of the drawers were filled with more of the same old pens, paperclips, receipts from decades ago. But the main central drawer was locked. It was a simple lock, and after a bit of jiggling with a paperclip, I heard a small click. I held my breath and pulled the drawer open. Inside it was neat. Shockingly neat. A stark contrast to the chaos that surrounded it. There was a small, leather-bound journal, a bundle of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon, and a single, small, velvet-covered box. My hands trembled as I picked up the journal. The leather was soft and worn. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, loopy, and unmistakably my aunt's. The first entry was dated the 12th of September 1985. She would have been around my age now. Michael gave me this journal today, the entry began. He said I have too many thoughts bouncing around in my head and they need a place to live. He's right, of course. He's always right. He makes my world feel so simple, so quiet. When I'm with him, the noise just stops. Michael. I'd never heard that name before. I kept reading, devouring, page after page. The journal painted a picture of a vibrant, passionate love affair. Michael was a professor, a poet. They met in Ann Arbor where she was taking art classes. They fell deeply, madly in love. Her writing was so full of life, of hope. She wrote about their plans to travel the world, to buy this very farmhouse and fill it not with things, but with light, laughter, and art. They were going to have children, a whole house full of them. Then I turned a page, and the tone changed. The entry was dated May 4th, 1986. The doctor called today. It's a girl. Michael cried when I told him. He held his hand on my stomach and whispered her name to me for the first time. Lily. Our little Lily. My heart stopped. A baby. My aunt had been pregnant. No one in the family had ever spoken of this. I read on my sense of dread growing with every page. The entries chronicled her pregnancy, her joy, her fears, all interwoven with her profound love for Michael. The last happy entry was filled with excitement about the baby shower they were planning. The next entry was dated 2 months later, the 18th of July 1986. The handwriting was jagged, almost illegible, the ink smudged by what could only have been tears. There is no God. Or if there is, he is cruel. The world is silent now. The noise is back, but it's different. It's a screaming silence. They took her from me. Stillborn, they said. Such a quiet, clinical word for a shattered universe. She never took a breath. My Lily. She was perfect, but she never breathed. Michael holds me, but I feel like he's miles away. Or I am. I don't know. There is a hole in the world where my daughter was supposed to be. I had to put the journal down. I couldn't breathe. I sat there on the dusty floor, surrounded by the debris of a broken life, and I wept. I wept for the aunt I never knew, for the baby she never got to hold, for the young woman whose vibrant world had been shattered into a million pieces. The horde suddenly made a terrible, tragic kind of sense. It wasn't about the things. It was about the whole. She had spent the rest of her life trying to fill an unfillable void. She couldn't throw anything away because she had already lost the most important thing. Everything else had to be held on to, guarded, protected. The house wasn't a prison. It was a mausoleum. A monument to a ghost. After a long time, I picked up the bundle of letters. They were from Michael. The early ones were filled with passionate love poems and plans for their future. But the later ones after the loss of Lily were filled with a desperate pleading pain. He wrote about her, pulling away about her refusal to talk about the things she was beginning to collect around her even then. The last letter was heartbreaking. My dearest Carol, it read, I cannot reach you anymore. You are barricading yourself behind a wall of memories and objects, and there is no room left for me. I will love you until the day I die, but I cannot save you from this grief. You have to choose to walk out of it, and I am afraid you have chosen to stay. I have to let you go. I have to save myself. He left. He left her alone in that house with her grief and her things. I felt a surge of anger at him, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of understanding. How long can you watch someone you love drown before you have to save yourself? Finally, my eyes fell on the small velvet box. With a deep sense of trepidation, I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a tiny silver locket. I opened it. On one side was a tiny professional photograph of a beautiful sleeping baby. She was perfect. On the other side, a single heartbreaking inscription, Lily. Forever in our hearts. I closed the box, holding it tight in my hand. The 90-day condition, the impossible task, it all clicked into place. This wasn't a punishment. This wasn't a cruel joke. This was an invitation. My aunt hadn't just left me her money. She had left me her story. And she knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the only way I would ever be able to find it was to do this. To dig through the layers of her pain, piece by piece, until I found the broken heart at the center of it all. This was her final message, her confession. And I had a terrible feeling that this was only the beginning. The journal ended there, but 30 years of her life were still unaccounted for, buried somewhere in the walls around me. What else had happened in this house? What other secrets was it holding? I looked around the room, no longer seeing a mess, but a story waiting to be read. And I knew my work here had just begun. After the discovery of the journal, everything changed. The house was no longer just a physical obstacle standing between me and $4 million. It had become a sacred space, a puzzle box I had to solve. The anger and resentment I'd felt towards my aunt had dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. I was no longer clearing out junk. I was excavating a life. My pace slowed. I stopped just bagging things indiscriminately. Every object I picked up, I examined. Did this mean something? Was this part of the story? The 90-day deadline, which had once seemed like a cruel joke, now felt like a ticking clock on my chance to understand. I started in the study, the room where I'd found the desk. I worked with the reverence of an archaeologist. I carefully sorted the books, finding inscriptions from Michael in many of them, his elegant handwriting, a ghostly presence in the dust. I found textbooks from her art classes filled with her own sketches in the margins, beautiful, detailed drawings of hands, faces, and flowers. The talent was undeniable, raw, and full of potential. A whole life, a whole career as an artist had been another casualty of that one terrible day in July 1986. My focus became singular. I needed to know more. What happened after Michael left? The journal ended so abruptly, leaving 30 years of her life a complete blank. My family was no help. I called my mom, trying to probe gently. Mom, did Aunt Carol ever mention a man named Michael from when she was younger? The silence on the phone was heavy. That was a long time ago, Alex, she finally said, her voice tight and clipped. It didn't end well. It's better to let sleeping dogs lie. It was the same shutdown I'd received my whole life whenever I asked about Carol's past. It wasn't just that they didn't know, it felt like they actively didn't want to know. They had accepted the caricature of the eccentric recluse because the reality was too painful to confront. It was in a closet off the main bedroom that I found the next piece of the puzzle. Tucked away on a high shelf, buried under a pile of moth-eaten blankets, were several old photo albums and a shoebox full of loose pictures. I took them out to the front porch away from the oppressive atmosphere of the house and sat on the rocking chair as the afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees. The first album was like a prequel to the journal. There was Carol, young and radiant, with my mother and their parents, my grandparents. Then came college. And then there he was, Michael. He was handsome, in a bookish, thoughtful way, with kind eyes and a warm smile. The photos showed them radiantly happy, laughing in a canoe bundled up in scarves while building a snowman, holding hands in front of this very farmhouse, which looked so much newer and more hopeful back then. You could feel their love radiating off the glossy paper. I flipped the page and the story changed. The next section was post-1986. Michael was gone. The photos became less frequent. Carol was in them, but she was a ghost of her former self. Her smile no longer reached her eyes. She looked gaunt, haunted. The vibrant light within her had been extinguished. And then I noticed something strange. In many of these later photos, taken at holiday gatherings or the rare family event she attended, there was another woman. She was always standing slightly apart from the main group, a shadow at the edge of the frame. She looked to be about Carol's age, with the same dark hair and a similar bone structure, but her expression was perpetually anxious, her eyes wide and searching. I didn't recognize her. I went through the shoebox of loose photos, and she was there too. A picture of her and Carol as teenagers, arms slung around each other. A photo from what looked like a family picnic where she was looking at the camera with a deer in the headlights expression while everyone else was smiling. Who was she? Why did I have this feeling that she was important? Just as I was trying to piece this new mystery together, my phone rang. It was Mr. Abernathy. His voice was as calm and professional as ever, but there was an underlying firmness to it. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I'm just calling for a progress check. We are now 35 days into your 90-day term." My blood ran cold. 35 days. It felt like I had only just started. I had cleared maybe a quarter of the house if I was being generous. "I understand it's a significant undertaking," he continued as if reading my mind, "but the terms of the will are ironclad. The Nature Conservancy is eager to take possession of the property on schedule. A full inspection will be conducted on day 91. If the house is not completely empty, the inheritance is forfeit. There are no extensions." A wave of panic washed over me. I looked from the porch back into the dark maw of the house at the mountains of stuff still waiting for me. I was spending too much time playing detective and not enough time working. The $4 million, which had started to feel secondary to the story, suddenly became very real again. It was my only way out of my old life, my only chance to build the one I dreamed of. Forfeiting it wasn't an option. The lawyer's call lit a fire under me. For the next week, I worked with a frantic, desperate energy. I forced myself to be less sentimental. I filled the dumpster twice over. But I couldn't shake the images from the photos. Carol's haunted eyes, the mystery woman in the background. It all felt connected. I was sure the answer was somewhere in this house, but I was running out of time to find it. My breakthrough came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. I was tackling the attic, a space I had been dreading. It was hot, cramped, and smelled of cedar and thyme. It was less cluttered than the rest of the house, filled mostly with neatly labeled boxes from my grandparents' time. But in the far back corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, was a large wooden steamer trunk. It wasn't labeled. It was locked with a heavy padlock. I almost walked away from it, telling myself I didn't have time. But something pulled me back. I found a crowbar in the garage, and with a great deal of effort, pried the lock open. The trunk was filled with Michael's things. It was a time capsule of their relationship. His worn copy of Leaves of Grass, a collection of his poetry published in small literary magazines. And at the very bottom, a small, unassuming box. Inside that box was a stack of letters he had written to Carol but had clearly never sent. They were written in the months after he had left her. They were filled with anguish, with love, with a desperate plea for her to seek help. But it was the very last letter that made my world tilt on its axis. My love, it read. "I spoke to your mother today. I had to. I told her I was afraid for you. I told her I was afraid you were becoming like Eleanor. She was so angry, Carol, not at you, but at the suggestion. She denied it, of course. But her fear was palpable. She knows. She knows what this is. Please, I beg you, don't let this sickness win. Don't let what happened to Eleanor happen to you, Eleanor." The mystery woman from the photographs. A sickness. My grandmother knew. My own grandmother knew what was happening, and she buried it. I felt a chill, despite the stifling heat of the attic. This horde wasn't just a reaction to one tragedy. It was a symptom of something deeper, something my family had conspired to keep secret for decades. I looked at the letter in my hand. At the bottom, Michael had written a return address. It was an address in Ann Arbor. I pulled out my phone and typed it into the map. It was a real place. And suddenly I knew what I had to do. The house could wait. The clock could tick. I couldn't move forward without going back. I had to find Michael. The decision to find Michael felt like a betrayal of my mission. My time was running out. Every hour I spent away from the house on Willow Creek Road was an hour that put $4 million at risk. My sister's pragmatic voice echoed in my head. "Focus on the task, Alex. The past is the past." But I couldn't. The story had its hooks in me now. It wasn't just about Carol anymore. It was about Eleanor. It was about my grandmother. It was a dark thread woven through the fabric of my family, and I felt compelled to pull on it no matter what unraveled. The inheritance wasn't just the money. I finally understood what Miss Abernathy had quoted from my aunt's will. This search, this uncovering this was the most important part of the inheritance. I left the farmhouse that afternoon, leaving the attic door open and a layer of dust on everything, and drove the 2 hours to Ann Arbor. The address from Michael's letter was in a quaint, historic part of town not far from the university campus. I felt a nervous energy buzzing under my skin. What was I even doing, showing up on a stranger's doorstep 30 years later? What if he had a new family? What if he slammed the door in my face? What could he possibly tell me that I didn't already know? But I had to try. I parked my car and walked down a tree-lined street filled with independent shops and cafes. I found the number from the letter. It wasn't a house. It was a bookstore. A beautiful, old-fashioned second-hand bookstore with a green-painted facade and gold lettering on the window that read, "The Open Book." The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside into the quiet, hallowed sanctuary of used books. The air smelled of aging paper and leather bindings. Sunlight streamed through the tall front windows, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny golden spirits. An old man sat behind the counter reading a thick hardcover. He looked up as I entered, peering at me over a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He had a kind, weathered face, a neatly trimmed white beard, and the same thoughtful eyes I had seen in the photographs. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was him. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice soft and raspy with age. I walked slowly towards the counter, my throat suddenly dry. I think so," I managed to say. "Are you Michael?" His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He closed his book, marking his page with a finger. "I am," he said. "Have we met?" "No, sir, we haven't. My name is Alex Carter." Carol Miller was my aunt. The name hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. He slowly took his glasses off and placed them on the counter, his hand trembling just a little. He stared at me, really looked at me for a long moment. "Carter," he said quietly. "Of course. You have her eyes." He was silent for a moment, lost in a memory 30 years deep. "I read about her passing in the alumni newsletter," he said finally. "I'm very sorry for your loss. She was a remarkable woman." "She left me her house," I said, getting straight to the point, "and her estate. But there was a condition. I have to clear out the house myself." He nodded slowly, a sad, knowing look on his face. "Of course she did," he whispered more to himself than to me. "That sounds just like her." He gestured to a small table with 2 chairs tucked into a quiet corner of the store. "Please," he said, "sit down." For the next hour, I told him everything. I told him about the state of the house, the mountains of possessions, the goat trails through the rooms. I told him about finding the desk, about reading her journal, about the devastating story of their baby Lily. As I spoke, his eyes filled with a pain that was still so fresh, so raw. He didn't interrupt me. He just listened, his face, a mask of sorrow. "I tried to help her," he said when I had finished. His voice was thick with emotion. "God, I tried. After we lost Lily, something in her just broke. It was like a light went out. The world became a dangerous place for her. She said she felt like things were slipping through her fingers, like she couldn't hold on to anything. So she started holding on to everything." He described how it began. Small things at first. She wouldn't throw out the newspapers. She started buying duplicates of things at the grocery store. She'd bring home trinkets from flea markets. At first, he thought it was just an eccentric part of her grieving process. But it grew. The piles got higher. The house became more and more crowded. "It wasn't about the objects, Alex," he explained, leaning forward, his eyes pleading for me to understand. "It was about control. The world had taken her child, a loss so completely out of her control. So she created a world she could control. A world where nothing ever left. Nothing was ever lost." He told me about the fights, the ultimatums, his desperate attempts to get her into therapy. But she refused. She didn't see it as a problem. She saw it as her solution. She built a fortress around her heart, and the walls were made of stuff, he said, his voice cracking. And eventually I realized there was no room for me inside. To stay would have been to let it consume me too. Leaving her was the hardest thing I've ever done. I've lived with that guilt every single day for 30 years. Eleanor, I said the name, feeling heavy on my tongue. I found letters. You mentioned someone named Eleanor. Michael's face darkened. Ah, yes. Eleanor, he sighed. That was the other ghost in the room. Eleanor was Carol's first cousin. Their mothers were sisters. Eleanor had the same affliction. We didn't have a name for it back then, we just called it her problem. Her house was the town scandal. She died young in her early 40s. There was a fire. They said she couldn't get out in time because the exits were all blocked. A cold dread washed over me. Carol was terrified of ending up like her, Michael continued. Absolutely terrified. But at the same time, she was drawn to it. It was like she was fighting against a current that was pulling her in the same direction. Your grandmother, Carol's mother, she saw it too. She just refused to acknowledge it. To her, it was a family shame, a weakness of character that needed to be hidden, not a sickness that needed to be treated. So this was it, the secret condition. It wasn't just Carol's grief. It was a genetic vulnerability, a dark inheritance passed down through the family, and losing Lily had been the catalyst that activated it. It was the match that lit the fuse. Why do you think she left me the house under this condition? I asked. Why put me through this? Michael looked at me, and his sad eyes held a flicker of something else, respect. Because she trusted you, he said simply. She knew you were the only one in the family who wouldn't just see the mess. You would see the story. She didn't want her life to be bulldozed and forgotten. She didn't want the shame to be the final word. She wanted to be understood. And she knew this was the only way. She wasn't punishing you, Alex. She was giving you a map to her soul. We sat in silence for a long time, the quiet hum of the bookstore, a comforting presence. He had given me the context, the why. He had validated everything I had been feeling. He had helped me see Carol not as a victim or a monster, but as a tragic hero in a battle she was destined to lose. As I got up to leave, he walked with me to the door. Wait, he said, and disappeared into a back room. He returned a moment later with a small, flat, canvas-wrapped object. He handed it to me. She gave this to me a long time ago. I think she'd want you to have it now. I unwrapped it. It was a small, beautiful oil painting of the view from the farmhouse porch, looking out over the fields at sunset. The colors were rich and vibrant, full of life and hope. It was signed in the corner CM. She painted this the week before we lost Lily, Michael said softly. It's how I always choose to remember her, not in the darkness, but in that light. I clutched the painting, my knuckles white. It was a glimpse of the woman she was supposed to be, the life she was supposed to have. As I thanked him and turned to go, he put a hand on my shoulder. One more thing, he said, his expression serious. She used to talk about a safe place in the house, a place she kept things that were too important to be lost in the chaos. She said it was somewhere no one would ever think to look, in the walls themselves. He squeezed my shoulder. If you really want to understand, you need to find it. I walked out of the bookstore and back into the sunlight, the bell chiming my departure. The world felt different, sharper, more real. I had found Michael. I had found the truth about Eleanor. But now there was one last mystery to solve. A safe place in the walls. I got in my car and started driving back to the farmhouse, the little painting on the seat beside me. The clock was ticking louder than ever, but now I had a destination. I wasn't just clearing a house anymore. I was going to find its heart. Driving back to Willow Creek Road, I felt a strange new sense of purpose. Michael's words echoed in my mind. She was giving you a map to her soul. The hoard was the map and the safe place was the destination. Before I was just trying to survive the 90 days. Now I felt like I was in a race with the 90 days, a race to find this final piece of the puzzle before time ran out and the house, along with its deepest secrets, was handed over to strangers. The $4 million still mattered. Of course, it was the engine driving this whole crazy train, but the nature of the treasure had changed. The real prize wasn't the money, it was the truth. When I arrived back at the farmhouse, the sun was low in the sky, casting the house in long, ominous shadows. It looked different now. Less like a prison, more like a tomb, a silent pyramid filled with the artifacts of a forgotten queen. I walked inside the painting Michael had given me, tucked carefully under my arm. I placed it on the one clear surface. I had created a small patch on the kitchen counter, and it was like lighting a candle in a dark cave. Its vibrant colors were a stark reminder of the light that had once existed here, in the walls themselves. Where do you even begin to look for something like that? The house was over 100 years old, all plaster and lath. I started knocking. I went from room to room, my knuckles rapping against the walls, listening for any deviation from the solid thud of a stud or the dull resonance of plaster. Thud, 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 thud. It was maddening. The sounds all blended together. The teetering piles of junk seemed to mock me, whispering that I was wasting my precious, dwindling time. Days turned into a week. I fell into a grueling rhythm. I'd spend the morning doing the hard physical labor of clearing and bagging, trying to make visible progress to appease the ghost of Mr. Abernathy's deadline. I filled another dumpster and then another. I was making a dent, finally. The living room was now partially visible. You could see the shape of the sofa, the outline of a fireplace. But every afternoon, my focus would shift. I would become the hunter, the seeker. I cleared paths along the walls of every single room from the basement to the attic, and I knocked and listened. I pushed on panels, looked for loose floorboards, and examined the backs of closets. Nothing. My frustration grew. Was Michael mistaken? Was it just a figure of speech? I was down to my last 30 days. The pressure was immense. The panic began to creep back in cold and sharp. Maybe I should just give up on this wild goose chase and focus on clearing the house. Maybe I already had the most important parts of the story. I decided to give it one last try. I focused on her bedroom. It felt like the most logical place, the epicenter of her world. The room was still the most daunting, a dense jungle of personal effects. It took me 2 full days just to clear a walkable path around the perimeter. And then I started knocking again. Thud, thud, thud. I was about to give up when I got to the closet. It was a deep walk-in closet, and like everywhere else, it was filled with boxes and bags. I cleared them out, creating a small, cramped space to stand in. The back wall felt different. It was an exterior wall, but when I knocked on one particular section low to the ground behind where a dresser might have once stood, the sound wasn't a thud. It was a hollow, papery thump. My heart leaped. I ran to the garage and grabbed a hammer and a crowbar. My hands were shaking with adrenaline. I tapped the spot again with the head of the hammer. Thump, thump, thump. It was definitely hollow. I took a deep breath and swung the hammer, sinking the claw into the old plaster. It cracked and crumbled, releasing a puff of ancient dust. I tore away a chunk of plaster and lath, and there behind it was not insulation and wood siding, but empty space. And in that space, I could see the dark, rusted corner of a metal box. It took me another 20 minutes of frantic, messy demolition to create an opening large enough to pull the box out. It was an old military-style footlocker, heavy and sealed, with a simple latch, not a lock. It was as if she wanted it to be found, but only by someone willing to literally break down the walls to get to it. I dragged it out of the closet and into the relative clearing of the bedroom, my lungs heaving, my body covered in a fine white powder. I knelt on the floor and slowly, reverently unlatched the lid. I lifted it open. It wasn't filled with money or jewelry. It was filled with journals, dozens of them. But as I lifted the first one out, I realized the handwriting was not the elegant, loopy script of my Aunt Carol. It was tighter, more severe, filled with sharp, anxious angles. I opened it to a random page. The entry was a frantic, rambling list of items purchased at a grocery store, followed by a paragraph of panicked self-recrimination for throwing out a glass jar. It was signed Eleanor. I picked up another and another. They were all Eleanor's. They were a harrowing first-hand account of a mind consumed by the same sickness that took my aunt. She wrote about the shame, the isolation, the overwhelming compulsion to save things from the world. She described the logic of the hoard, how every object was a memory, and to discard it was to discard a piece of herself. It was Carol's story, but magnified, more desperate, and without any of the poetry or self-awareness. But that wasn't the biggest shock. Beneath Eleanor's journals was another set bound in older, more faded leather. The handwriting was different again. It was a formal, old-fashioned cursive, the kind my grandmother used. I opened the top one, my hands trembling so badly I could barely read the page. The entry was from 1958. Robert brought me a new set of china today, it read. It's lovely, but I don't know where I will put it. The cabinets are so full. I feel a terrible anxiety when I think of getting rid of the old set, even though it's chipped. It was my mother's. Everything feels too precious to let go of. Robert calls it my sentimental streak. But it feels heavier than that. It feels like a fear of empty spaces. I sank back against the wall, the journals spread out around me. My grandmother. It didn't just start with Eleanor. It went back another generation. This was the secret. The real secret condition. Not just hoarding, but the genetic predisposition for severe anxiety and obsessive-compulsive behavior that manifested as hoarding. Carol's grief over losing Lily wasn't the cause. It was the trigger. It was the catastrophic event that opened the floodgates and allowed the genetic darkness to pour in and consume her. It explained everything. It explained Carol's terror of ending up like Eleanor. It explained my own mother's obsessive, almost surgical tidiness. It wasn't a preference, it was a reaction. A lifelong, desperate battle against the genetic tide she must have known was inside her. My aunt hadn't just left me a map to her soul. She had left me a map to a hidden family illness, a generational curse passed down from mother to daughter. This was her warning. This was her plea. Understand us. Understand what we were fighting. I sat there for what felt like hours, the dust settling around me. As I began to carefully place the journals back in the box, my fingers brushed against one last item at the bottom. It was a thick, sealed envelope. On the front, in my Aunt Carol's familiar, elegant script, was a name that made my blood run cold. It wasn't addressed to me, it was addressed to my mother, Susan. I held the letter in my hand. It was recent. The paper felt new. Carol had put it in here before she died, knowing I would be the one to find it. A final message from one sister to another, delivered by the son who was never supposed to know the truth. 1,000 questions exploded in my mind, but one screamed louder than all the rest. My God, does my mom know about all of this? And if she does, why has she never, ever said a word? The drive from Willow Creek Road to my parents' suburban home in Naperville felt like traveling between two different dimensions. I left behind a world of chaotic, dusty truth and entered a realm of sterile, suffocating order. My mother's house was her masterpiece. It was a monument to control. Everything was pristine, from the perfectly manicured lawn without a single weed to the gleaming hardwood floors inside. The air didn't smell like a home. It smelled of lemon, scented polish, and a faint chemical hint of bleach. It was the smell of a constant low-grade war against disorder. Growing up, I'd always found it comforting. Now, for the first time, I saw it for what it was, a fortress just like Carol's. My aunt had built her walls out of objects. My mother had built hers out of empty, gleaming surfaces. I found her in the kitchen wiping down a countertop that was already so clean I could see my own stressed-out reflection in it. She smiled when she saw me, a bright, brittle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Alex, what a surprise! You look exhausted, honey. Is that old house wearing you out? We need to talk, Mom, I said, my voice flatter than I intended. I held up the thick sealed envelope. Her name, Susan, written in Carol's elegant hand, was facing her. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. It was a look I'd seen only a handful of times in my life, and it always meant I had crossed an invisible, unforgivable line. She snatched the envelope from my hand, her knuckles white. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "I found it. In the house. In a box with Eleanor's journals. And Grandma's," I added, letting the names hang in the air between us. She flinched as if I'd struck her. "You had no right," she hissed. "That was private. Carol's life, her problems, were not some mystery for you to solve. She left it for me to find Mom. Don't you see? The whole thing, the condition, the 90 days, it was all so I would find this, so I would understand. So you would have to face it." I was pleading now, my voice rising. I read her journal. I know about Lily. I know about Michael. And now I know about Eleanor. I know that Grandma was fighting this too. "Why did you hide it? Why did you let her suffer alone? Suffer alone?" My mother laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed unnervingly in the pristine kitchen. "I spent my entire life trying to help her. I begged her to get help. I offered to hire cleaners, therapists, organizers. Your father and I offered to have her come live with us. And do you know what she did? She shut me out. She shut all of us out. She chose that house. She chose her things over her family, over me." She was pacing now, her movements sharp and agitated, a shocking disruption in the perfect stillness of her home. She looked at the letter in her hand as if it were a venomous snake. "So you just gave up on her?" I asked, my own anger rising to meet hers. "No, I never gave up on her," she shouted, whirling to face me. "But there are some things you can't fix, Alex. Some things you have to wall off to protect yourself, to protect your own family. I have a husband, a daughter, a son. I couldn't let her sickness, that chaos, infect my life, my home." She gestured wildly around the spotless room. This is how I fight it, by not letting it in, not 1 inch. It was a confession. The most honest thing she'd ever said to me. Her perfect house, her obsession with cleanliness, it was all a desperate, terrified reaction to the genetic monster she knew was lurking in her bloodline. She wasn't just cleaning her counters. She was scrubbing away the ghost of her cousin, the ghost of her own mother's anxieties, the ghost of the sister she couldn't save. "So you lied," I said quietly. "You lied to Jessica and me our whole lives. You pretended Aunt Carol was just eccentric. You let us think she was just a weird, lonely woman instead of telling us the truth that she was sick with a sickness that runs in our family." "It was to protect you," she cried, her composure finally cracking, her eyes filling with tears. What was I supposed to say? That your aunt, your grandmother, that they had this shameful weakness, that there's a darkness in our family that swallows people whole? I wanted you and your sister to have a normal life free from that. Fear. Knowing the truth isn't a fear, Mom. It's a defense, I said, my voice hardening. What if I have it? What if one of Jessica's kids has it? Don't we have a right to know what we might be fighting? That question hung in the air unanswered. She stared at me, her face, a mixture of fury and absolute devastation. She looked down at the letter, then back at me. "You think you understand, but you don't," she whispered. "You spent a few weeks digging through her past. I lived with it for 50 years. She walked over to a drawer, pulled out a pair of scissors, and before I could react, she began to cut the letter Carol's last words into tiny, unrecognizable pieces. She didn't read it. She simply destroyed it. She let the pieces fall like snowflakes into the trash can under the sink. "Get out, Alex," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Get out of my house." I stood there for a moment, stunned into silence by the violence of the act. She had literally and figuratively destroyed her sister's final attempt to reach her. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and I didn't see the strong, put-together woman I had known my whole life. I saw someone just as trapped as Carol, but in a different kind of prison. A prison of denial with walls made of glass polished so bright that no one could see the prisoner inside. I walked out without another word. As I got into my car, my phone buzzed. It was another text from my sister, Jessica. "How's it going, Mom says? You're getting bogged down in the sentimentality of it all. Seriously, Alex, just get it done. The money is waiting." I threw my phone onto the passenger seat in disgust. They didn't get it. They would never get it. My confrontation had been a spectacular failure. I hadn't brought healing. I had just deepened the wound. I had unearthed the truth, but my mother had just buried it again deeper this time. As I drove away, I felt a new chilling thought take root. I had accused my mother of giving up on Carol. But what if she was right? What if Carol was a lost cause? And what if by immersing myself so completely in her world, in her sickness, I was letting it infect me too? For the first time, I looked at the dust on my clothes and the grime under my fingernails, and I felt a wave of revulsion. I just wanted to be clean. The fight with my mother left a scar. For 2 days, I didn't go to the farmhouse. I couldn't. I stayed in my Chicago apartment, scrubbing my skin raw in the shower, cleaning my own small space with a frantic energy that felt unnervingly familiar. My mother's words echoed in my head. I couldn't let the chaos infect my life. I looked at the stacks of art books in my own living room, the canvases leaning against the wall, my own organized creative clutter, and felt a jolt of fear. Was this how it started? My mind was a battlefield. One side, the artist, felt a deep spiritual connection to my aunt's story. The other side, my mother's son, was terrified, screaming at me to run to finish the job, take the money, and escape before the family darkness claimed me too. The deadline was the only thing that forced me back. 22 days left. The panic was a physical thing now, a constant pressure in my chest. I returned to the house with a new cold detachment. No more detective work. No more emotional archaeology. I was a machine. I worked from dawn until dusk, hauling, bagging, sorting. I was ruthless. I stopped looking at old photographs. I stopped reading snippets of letters. I just cleared. The house began to breathe again. Sunlight reached floors that hadn't seen it in 30 years. I could walk from one room to another without navigating a goat trail. The physical progress was immense, but my spirit was shrinking. I felt hollowed out, haunted. I was winning the battle but losing the war. I was erasing my aunt's story just as my mother had erased her letter. It was during a late-night break from the physical labor, as I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone, that I had an idea. I couldn't get one of my mother's phrases out of my head. In the heat of her anger, she had said, "I have spent my life helping people like her." It was probably just a figure of speech, a defensive exaggeration. But what if it wasn't driven by a sudden, inexplicable curiosity? I opened my laptop and started searching. I didn't even know what I was looking for. I typed in my mother's name, Susan Carter, along with terms like charity, mental health, and volunteer. For an hour, I found nothing but the usual digital footprint, real estate records for their house mentions in the local paper Society, pages her LinkedIn profile listing her as a retired office manager. It was a dead end. I was about to give up when I tried one last desperate search. I typed in Eleanor and my family's surname, and there it was. The fifth result down was a link to a simple, slightly dated-looking website. The name at the top of the page hit me like a ton of bricks, the Eleanor Project. It was a non-profit foundation based in the Chicago suburbs. Its mission statement was written right on the homepage, dedicated to providing practical support, cleanup assistance, and compassionate mental health resources for individuals and families affected by compulsive hoarding disorder. My blood turned to ice. I scrolled down the page, my hand shaking on the mouse. There was a founder's message section, and there was my mother's picture. It was a professional headshot, her hair perfect, her smile warm and controlled. The message alongside it was a masterpiece of compassionate, impersonal prose. She wrote about the hidden epidemic of hoarding, the shame and isolation it caused. She wrote about losing a cherished family member to the illness, and vowed to help others avoid the same tragedy. She didn't use Eleanor's name in the message itself, but the foundation's name was a secret tombstone, a public acknowledgement of the secret she refused to speak in her own home. I clicked through the website, my mind reeling from the hypocrisy. There were photos from fundraising, luncheons, pictures of my mother cutting ribbons, smiling alongside mental health professionals, and grateful-looking families whose homes had been cleared by the project's volunteers. She was a hero, a public champion for the very people she privately called a shameful weakness. She had created an entire organization, a public persona dedicated to fighting the very demon she wouldn't acknowledge in her own sister, her own mother, or herself. It was the ultimate act of control to manage the illness from a safe, sterile distance, turning the messy, painful family trauma into a neat, tax-deductible foundation. I found a news and events page. Their annual fundraising gala, their biggest event of the year, was scheduled for next Saturday. It was being held at a country club not 10 miles from my parents' house. A new kind of anger began to burn inside me, an anger that was cold and clear, not hot and confused. This was more than just denial. This was a breathtaking, monumental lie. She wasn't just hiding from the truth. She was profiting from it, building a reputation on the very tragedy she refused to confront. She was using Eleanor's memory as a brand while erasing Carol's eau de flast. I looked around the nearly empty room in my aunt's house. I had been working to erase her too, driven by the fear and shame my mother had instilled in me. But no more. I finally understood. The inheritance wasn't just the money, and it wasn't just the story. It was the responsibility. My aunt didn't just want me to understand her. She wanted me to fight for her, to give her the voice my mother had denied her. I picked up the footlocker, the one I'd pulled from the wall containing the journals of Eleanor and my grandmother. I took the small painting Michael had given me. I had 15 days left on my deadline. But first there was something I had to do. I went back to the website and bought a single ticket to the Eleanor Project's annual gala. My confrontation in my mother's kitchen had been a failure because it was on her terms in her fortress of denial. This time I would confront her on my terms. I would walk into her house of glass, her perfect public monument to a sanitized tragedy, and I would show her the messy, beautiful, heartbreaking truth she had spent a lifetime trying to hide. I was going to bring Carol and Eleanor with me. Walking into the ballroom of the Oak Brook Country Club felt like stepping onto a movie set. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting a warm golden light on tables draped in white linen and adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved silently through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. The air was filled with the gentle murmur of polite conversation and the distant strains of a string quartet. It was a world of elegance, order, and carefully curated compassion. It was my mother's world, perfected and magnified. I stood in the doorway feeling completely out of place. I was wearing my one and only suit, which felt tight in the shoulders and smelled faintly of mothballs. Under my arm, I clutched a leather portfolio. Inside was Eleanor's first journal, my grandmother's journal, and the small, vibrant painting of the sunset my aunt had painted for Michael. They were my ghosts, my evidence, my truth. I scanned the room and saw her immediately. She was the queen of this court. She stood near the stage looking radiant in a tasteful navy blue gown, accepting compliments, and shaking hands, the perfect picture of a gracious and dedicated philanthropist. My father stood beside her, a proud, supportive husband, beaming at his wife's success. He caught my eye across the room and his smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of confusion and alarm in his eyes before he quickly looked away. He knew I wasn't supposed to be here. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, not to drink, but just to have something to hold. My heart was pounding a frantic drum against my ribs. This was a terrible idea. I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of my family's life, and I had no idea what the fallout would be. For a moment, I thought about turning around, walking out, and just going back to the house to finish the job. But then I thought of Carol alone in that house for 30 years. I thought of Eleanor dying in a fire because she couldn't escape her prison. I took a deep breath and started walking. I didn't approach my mother directly. Instead, I found my father, first intercepting him near the silent auction tables. "Dad," I said quietly. He looked at me, his face a mixture of surprise and stern disapproval. "Alex, what are you doing here? I'm here to support the cause," I said, a sharp, ironic edge to my voice. "It's a wonderful thing Mom is doing, helping all those people." "Your mother has put her heart and soul into this," he said defensively. "She's turned a family tragedy into something positive." "A family tragedy?" I asked, looking him directly in the eye. "Which one? The one we're allowed to talk about, or the one we're not?" His face hardened. "This is not the time or the place, Alex. You're upsetting your mother." "Aunt Carol is dead," I said, my voice low but firm. "She died alone in a house that had become her tomb. Don't you think Mom is already upset? Don't you think she's been upset for 50 years? He had no answer to that. He just stared at me, his jaw tight. It was then that I realized his role in all of this. He wasn't just a bystander. He was the guardian of the secret, the enforcer of the silence. He had enabled my mother's denial, building the walls of her perfect house right alongside her because it was easier than facing the messy, frightening truth. The program was beginning. People were taking their seats. My mother walked onto the stage to a round of warm applause. She stood at the podium, the picture of poise and confidence. She began her speech telling a sanitized, well-rehearsed story about a cousin who struggled with a collecting problem, a story that painted Eleanor as a tragic, one-dimensional victim, and my mother as the grieving relative who turned her pain into purpose. I couldn't listen to it. As she spoke, I made my way to the front of the ballroom, weaving through the tables until I was standing in the aisle just a few feet from the stage. My father saw me, his eyes widening in panic, but he was seated at the head table too far away to stop me. My mother's voice faltered as she saw me. She lost her place in her speech, her eyes locking on the leather portfolio in my hand. The polite smiles on the faces in the audience began to curdle into confusion. The silence in the room grew heavy. "You've left out a few parts of the story, Mom," I said, my voice shaking but carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. Her face went pale. "Alex, please," she whispered into the microphone, the sound echoing through the speakers. "Sit down." I ignored her. I walked up the small set of stairs and stood beside her at the podium. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on me. I opened the portfolio. First, I took out Carol's painting and placed it on the podium facing the audience. Its vibrant colors were a shocking slash of life in the sterile environment. "This is a painting by my Aunt Carol," I said, my voice growing stronger. "My mother's sister. She painted it before a terrible tragedy stole her future. She was a brilliant artist. She was a vibrant, loving woman, and she suffered from the same illness as Eleanor. She died 2 months ago, and I have spent the last 75 days of my life excavating her home and her story." My mother looked like she was going to collapse. She was shaking her head, tears welling in her eyes, whispering, "No, no, no." I then took out the 2 journals. I held them up. "This was my grandmother's journal," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction I didn't know I had. "In it, she writes about her fear of empty spaces, about the anxiety that she passed down to her daughters. And this I held up, the other one was Eleanor's. In it, she writes about her shame, her loneliness, and her feeling that her family was hiding her away like a dirty secret." I turned and looked directly at my mother. The entire room, the hundreds of people, they all faded away. There was only the 2 of us on a brightly lit stage, surrounded by the ghosts of 3 generations. "This isn't just Eleanor's story," I said, my voice softening, filled not with anger anymore, but with a deep, crushing sorrow. "It's Carol's story. It's Grandma's story. And it's your story, Mom. You haven't turned a tragedy into a purpose. You've hidden one tragedy behind another. You've been helping strangers because you were too afraid to help your own sister. You built this entire foundation to fight a monster that you refused to name in your own home. And then the dam broke. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, ragged sound of a lifetime of grief and fear finally breaking free. She crumpled her perfect poise, shattering into a million pieces. She wasn't the founder, the philanthropist, the pillar of the community anymore. She was just a daughter, a sister, a woman who had been running from a ghost her entire life, only to find it waiting for her on a stage in front of everyone. My father rushed to the stage, his face white with shock. He wrapped his arms around my mother as she wept, finally, truly wept for the sister and the cousin and the mother she had lost, and for the secret she could no longer carry. I stood there for a moment, the journals still in my hand, the painting of the sunset, a beacon of hope in the wreckage. The reckoning had come. The truth was finally out. But as I looked at my broken mother, I felt no triumph, no victory. Only the quiet, devastating understanding that the cost of this truth might be the very family I had been trying to understand. The aftermath of the gala was a quiet implosion. My mother, taking an indefinite leave of absence, checked into a residential treatment program for anxiety and complicated grief. The silence from my family was broken first by my father. He met me at the now empty farmhouse on the final day of my deadline. He looked tired, but the anger was gone, replaced by a weary sadness. "You were right, Alex," he admitted. "We were wrong." He explained my mother's lifelong private battle with her own compulsions, and he gave me a check not just for the cleanup, but as a quiet apology. Soon after, my sister called, humbled and remorseful, and for the first time we truly connected. 6 months later, my life is unrecognizable. With the $4 million, I quit my job and opened the art studio I always dreamed of. I made a large anonymous donation to the Eleanor Project to fund the Carol Miller Wing for continued healing, giving my aunt the legacy she deserved. My relationship with my family is fragile, but it's finally honest. My mother is in therapy, and we are slowly, awkwardly getting to know each other for the first time. Recently, I revisited the farmhouse, now a nature center and artist's retreat. Inside, hanging over the mantelpiece for all to see, was Carol's painting of the sunset. I finally understood her true inheritance. It wasn't the money. It was the chance to break a generational cycle of shame and silence. My aunt had lived in a house of shadows, my mother in a house of glass. But me, thanks to the truth, I was finally free to build a house of my own. A house filled with light,